case. So this is the superior salivatory nucleus. So deep to it lies the lacrimatory nucleus. So the motor root, so it joins with the fibers from the superior salivatory nucleus, and the facial nerve from the motor nucleus, it winds round the abducens nerve nucleus. So this is the abducens nerve nucleus here. So it winds round the abducens nerve nucleus here. So when it winds down here, it forms the facial colliculus. Now you must have seen this in the floor of the fourth ventricle. So when it winds round the motor root, when it winds round the abducens nerve nucleus, so here it forms the facial colliculus, which is in the floor of the fourth ventricle. Okay. Now from here it runs downward and forward. Okay, and here it forms the internal genu. So it forms two genu, internal as well as the external genu. Now after running forward and downward, after forming the internal genu, it emerges from the junction of the pons and the medulla. So I hope you know this. So this is the pons, this is the medulla, so this is the pontomedullary junction. So the facial nerve, it emerges from the junction of the pons and the medulla. So this is the emergence of the facial nerve. Then after this, it pierces or it traverses the posterior cranial fossa here, so posterior cranial fossa. Then here it enters the internal acoustic meatus. So you know this is the petrous part of the temporal bone here. So this is the internal acoustic meatus. So here it enters the internal acoustic meatus along with the other nerve and the vessel. So the other nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve and the labyrinthine vessel. So you find along with the facial nerve within the internal acoustic meatus. Okay. Now after that, it runs within the petrous part of the temporal bone, isn't it? So internal acoustic meatus is also present within the petrous part of the temporal bone. So the nerve runs within the petrous part. So that is also known as the intrapetrous course. Okay, now come to the intrapetrous course. So at the bottom of the internal acoustic meatus, the two roots, that is the motor and the sensory root. So this is the motor root here. So this is the sensory root. So the motor and the sensory root, they unite and they form the trunk of the facial nerve. So here it forms the trunk of the facial nerve. Then after forming the trunk, then it enters the facial canal. So where do you find the facial canal? Within the tympanic cavity. Okay. So it emerges out here from the junction of the pons and the medulla. Then it enters the internal acoustic meatus, that is within the petrous part of the temporal bone. So at the bottom of the internal acoustic meatus, the two roots join and they form the trunk of the facial nerve. And the trunk of the facial nerve enters here within the facial canal. Now we should know its course within the facial canal also. Now, so this is within the petrous part of the temporal. So this is inside the petrous part of the temporal bone. So the petrous part of the temporal bone, it consists of the middle ear cavity. So this is the middle ear cavity here, tympanic cavity. And here, so inside this, so here, medial to the middle ear cavity is here you have the inner ear. Okay. Now, course within the facial canal, the first part of the nerve, we can see the first part of the facial nerve. So it passes above the vestibule of the inner ear. Now, see, this is the internal acoustic meatus. So within the internal acoustic meatus, you find the facial nerve here. So here it lies above the vestibule of the inner ear. So here, okay. So this part is the first part of the facial nerve. Okay. Now from here, it reaches the medial wall of the middle ear. Now this is the middle ear cavity, and this is the medial wall. So from here till here, okay. So this part, so this is the first part here, okay. Then from here, it reaches the medial wall of the middle ear cavity. So when it runs here, it makes a sharp turn here, and where it forms a external genu. So it has two genu. So one is the internal, and this is the external genu. So when it turns backward here, so it forms a sharp turn. So here it forms the external genu, and here you can find the geniculate ganglion. So here lies the geniculate ganglion. Okay, so this is the geniculate ganglion here. Okay, so internal acoustic meatus, the facial nerve here. So this is the geniculate ganglion, which lies in the sharp turn. So that is known as the external genu. Okay, from here, it enters to the medial wall of the middle ear. Now, this is the medial wall of the middle ear here. Okay, so this forms the second part. So you can say this is the second part of the facial nerve, which runs along the medial wall of the middle ear cavity. So this is the second part here. Okay, now from its medial wall, it runs along the posterior wall. Now, this is the posterior wall of the middle ear cavity. Okay, so this vertical part, so this is known as the third part of the facial nerve. Okay, so this is the facial canal. Okay, so here you can see this is the first part here. This is the first part. Here it forms the genu, and here lies the geniculate ganglion. So this is the second part on the medial wall of the middle ear cavity. Now this runs along the posterior wall of the middle ear cavity. Okay, so this is the third part here. So from here, so or within the facial canal or the vertebral part of the facial canal, here it gives rise to two branches. You can see here. So this is the nerve to stapedius muscle. Okay, so not to the stapedius muscle, because within the middle ear cavity lies the stapedius muscle. So this is the nerve to the stapedius muscle. So the stapedius muscle is supplied by a branch from the facial nerve within the facial canal here. So the another nerve, is the chorda tympani nerve. Now this is the chorda tympani nerve. Okay. So after giving the two branches here, it comes out through the stylomastoid foramen. Now you, all of you have seen the stylomastoid foramen in the skull. Okay, so through which the facial nerve comes out of the cranial cavity. Now this is the stylomastoid foramen. So is this clear, Surya? Bujhe ki buzano? So you should know the course of the facial nerve and how it emerges from the pontomedullary junction, enters the interacoustic meatus, how it runs within the petrous part of the temporal bone, and from there how it enters the middle ear cavity along the facial canal. And along the facial canal, it gives branch to the stapedius muscle, and also it gives a branch to the branch that is the chorda tympani nerve. Then through the stylomastoid foramen, it comes out. So after that, okay, within that, you should also know the branches of communication and how it communicates with the other branches. That is also important. Now, branches of communication. So in this figure, you can see this is the pons, and this is the medulla, and this is the pontomedullary junction. Okay, this is the pontomedullary junction here. So here you can see the emergence of the facial nerve, the dark black color. Okay, so this is the motor root here, and you can also see the light, the thinner one is the sensory root. Okay, now the facial nerve at the level of the genicular ganglion. Now you know where the genicular ganglion lies. I showed you the external genu. Now this is the genicular ganglion here. Okay, in this figure. So this is the level of the genicular ganglion here. Now the facial nerve, it communicates with the pterygopalatine ganglion here. Now this is the pterygopalatine ganglion. Okay, so this is the genu. So this is the pterygopalatine ganglion. So the facial nerve, it communicates with the pterygopalatine ganglion by the greater petrosal nerve. Now this is the greater petrosal nerve here. Okay, so this is the greater petrosal nerve. So why the greater petrosal nerve? It communicates with the pterygopalatine ganglion. Then here, the greater petrosal nerve, it unites with the deep petrosal nerve here. Now this is the deep petrosal nerve here. So the greater petrosal unites with the deep petrosal nerve here, and here it forms the nerve of the pterygoid canal. Now this is the nerve of the pterygoid canal. Okay, so this is the nerve of the pterygoid canal. So this is the pterygopalatine ganglion. So the postganglionic fibers from here supplies the lacrimal gland. Now this is the lacrimal gland. So you should know how it communicates with the other branches as well. So genu here, the greater petrosal nerve. So this is the greater petrosal nerve here, joins with the deep petrosal nerve, forms the nerve of pterygoid canal. Then it communicates with the pterygopalatine ganglion here. So the postganglionic fibers, it supplies the lacrimal gland here. Similarly, it also communicates with the OT ganglion. So here in this figure, so this is the OT ganglion here. So it also has communication with the OT ganglion by a branch which joins the lesser petrosal nerve here. So this is the greater petrosal nerve here, and this is the lesser petrosal nerve. Okay, so through this lesser petrosal nerve, it communicates with the OT ganglion. Now this is the lesser petrosal nerve. Now the fibers are mainly for the glands like lacrimal gland, glands of the soft palate, the nasal mucosa. They all pass through the sensory root, then to the trunk, then by the greater petrosal nerve, then forms the nerve of pterygoid canal, then they are related to the pterygopalatine ganglion. Whereas the postganglionic fibers for the lacrimal gland, okay, they pass through the zygomatic as well as the lacrimal nerves, and for palate and the nasal mucosa, they mainly pass by the greater and the lesser palatine nerves. Now, coming to its branches. Okay, so what are the different branches? Now, this I have already said. So within the facial canal, it gives nerve to stapedius to supply the stapedius muscle and the chorda tympani nerve. So this is the chorda tympani nerve. Okay, so this is the chorda tympani nerve. So this is also a branch within the facial canal. Then after that, it comes out from the stylomastoid foramen. So this is the stylomastoid foramen. So at its exit, it further gives rise to branches. So what are the branches after its exit from the stylomastoid foramen? Now here it gives rise to the, so this is the stylomastoid foramen here. So here it gives rise to the posterior auricular branch. So this is also a branch from the facial nerve. Okay. So the posterior auricular branch. So this is the posterior auricular branch. Then it also gives a branch to supply the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. So posterior belly of the digastric muscle, and it also supplies the stylohyoid muscle. So all these are the branches after its exit from the immediately, or you can say immediately after its exit from the stylomastoid foramen. So posterior auricular branch, nerve to posterior belly of digastric, and nerve to stylohyoid muscle. And coming to the extracranial part. So what happens after giving these branches? So it pierces the parotid gland here. Okay, so this is the facial nerve. As you know, the motor part supplies all the muscles of the face as well as the muscles of the scalp. So what happens? So this is the parotid gland here, the face. Then after giving those branches, it pierces the parotid gland here. Okay, so it pierces the parotid gland here. Here it crosses the styloid process. Okay, the sharp process, the skull bone. So it crosses the styloid process. Then here it also crosses the retromandibular vein. Now this is the retromandibular vein, the superficial one. Then also the external carotid artery. Now this is the external carotid artery here. So it crosses the styloid process, retromandibular vein, the external carotid artery. Then it reaches behind the neck of the mandible here. Okay, so the facial nerve, you should remember its course. So you find the facial nerve also at the neck of the mandible. Then it finally terminates within the parotid gland. So you can see this is the facial nerve here. So within the parotid gland, or the superficial layer of the parotid gland, it ends by dividing into the 5 branches. Okay. So first one is the temporal. So it gives rise to the temporal branch. So these are the different branches in the face. So it gives rise to the temporal branch here, then the zygomatic branch here, then the buccal. The buccal further divides into the upper buccal and the lower buccal. Okay, so further divides, this is the buccal branch, which further divides into upper and lower buccal branch. Then next is the marginal mandibular branch and cervical branch. Okay, and these branches of the facial nerve in the face, okay, while terminating in the face, it resembles the foot of the goose, so it is also known as the pes anserinus. Okay, so these branches is also known as the pes anserinus. So this is how the facial nerve ends. So it goes up and so you should know the different 7 cranial nerve importance. So you should know the functional components. You should know where the nuclei are located. Then how it emerges from the appontomedullary junction, enters the petrous part, so the intrapetrous course. Then within the facial canal, how it gives branch to the stapedius muscle, then the chorda tympani nerve to the taste sensation. Then how the branches communicate with the other branches and supply the other muscles as well. Then branches at its exit, then the extracranial part, how it reaches the parotid gland, and how it terminates by dividing into the 5 different branches, which is also known as the pes anserinus. So this you should know all. And you may be confused now because you have not started the head and neck portion, because you have to study the muscles of the face, then the scalp, and then it becomes clear to you. Okay, more clear to you, because it supplies all the muscles of the face and as well as the scalp. Then all the muscles of neck, that is stylohyoid muscle, the posterior auricular branch, so it will be very clear after you study the muscles of the head and neck and the face. Now come to the facial nerve lesion. So what happens when the facial nerve is lesioned? Okay. Now the motor nucleus, they mainly supply through the corticonuclear fibers. Now this is the cerebral cortex here. So this is the nucleus here. So as you know, it supplies the muscles of the face. So upper facial muscles, that is the muscles of the forehead and around the eyeball, and these are the lower facial muscles. Okay, so all these muscles are supplied by the facial nerve. Okay. Now this is the cortex, so this is the nucleus. Now here you can see the fibers from one side. Okay, so this is the cerebral cortex of the left side here. See, you can see the fibers for the lower facial muscles. So the lower facial muscles, they receive the fibers from the motor cortex of the opposite side, isn't it? So this is the one. So supplying the muscles, lower facial muscles. So they receive the fibers from the opposite side of the cortex. You can see the crossing of the fibers here. Okay, so in this figure, so here you can see the crossing of the fibers to supply the muscles of the lower part of the face. Okay, whereas the upper facial muscle. So you just keep in mind that the lower facial muscles, they usually get the fibers from the opposite side of the cortex. Okay, just follow this line, opposite side of the cortex. Now coming to the upper facial muscles. So these are the upper facial muscles. See, they receive the fibers from the motor cortex of both the cerebral hemispheres. See, this is the upper facial muscles. So it's getting the fibers from same side as well as from the opposite side. So is this clear? So the upper facial muscles, they get the fibers from both the sides of the cerebral cortex, whereas the lower facial muscles, they get the fibers from the opposite side of the cerebral cortex. Okay. And depending upon the lesion, okay, so depending upon the lesion, the lesion can be either the supranuclear lesion. So depending upon the site, okay, so depending upon the site of the lesion, it can be either the supranuclear lesion, that is above the nucleus. So it can be the nuclear lesion, or it can be the infranuclear lesion, that is below the level of the nucleus. So any type of facial nerve injury can occur. Now coming to the supranuclear, for example here, so this is the supranuclear lesion. So the supranuclear lesion of the facial nerve, it mainly occurs due to occlusion of the vessels supplying the internal capsule and the motor cortex. Okay, so because of the vascular occlusion supplying the internal capsule and the motor cortex, the supranuclear lesion can occur. Okay, so whenever there is supranuclear lesion, see what happens. So whenever there is lesion at this point, so there will be loss of movements of the lower side of the facial muscles, usually of the opposite side, because this lower facial muscle is getting the fibers from the opposite side of the cortex. So whenever there is lesion at this point, so this sided facial muscle, okay, in the lower part will be paralyzed. Okay, so this part will be paralyzed. Now coming to the upper facial muscles, how it works as the upper facial muscles, they get the fibers from both the sides. So the upper facial muscles, they are usually escaped. Okay, because it's getting the fibers from both the sides. Okay. Now, whenever there is nuclear, a lesion is nuclear lesion, that is lesion in the pons. Okay, so nuclear lesion, that is lesion in the pons. So whenever there is nuclear lesion, it involves all the muscles of the face on the affected side, on the side of the lesion. So there will be paralysis of the facial muscles on the affected side, upper as well as the lower. And coming to the infranuclear paralysis, so there are so many infranuclear below the lesion, the peripheral palsy, you can say. So lesion in the peripheral part of the facial nerve. So many symptoms can occur. So one of them is the Bell's palsy. So usually whenever there is lesion in the internal acoustic meatus, so the Bell's palsy occur. So lesion in the internal acoustic meatus. So Bell's palsy occur, as you know, along with the facial nerve, the internal acoustic meatus is also consists of the vestibulocochlear nerve. So along with the Bell's palsy, so deafness can also occur because of the involvement of the vestibulocochlear nerve. So what happens whenever there is a Bell's palsy? So you can see there is a loss of transverse because of the forehead. Okay, so this is the paralysis of this side. Okay, it's paralysis of the right side, facial nerve. So there will be loss of transverse because of the forehead. Then lower eyelid droops. Normally, the lower eyelid droops here. So the palpable fissure is usually wider than the normal. Okay, so the palpable fissure is wider because it involves all the muscles of the eye as well. The auricularis oculi, which are not right now, the auricularis oculi here, the auricularis oris muscle here, the occipital muscles here, okay, the iliac nerve. So there are so many facial muscles. So as it involves all the muscles, so these are the symptoms that occur. And when you ask the patient to close the eyes, what happens? The patient won't be able to close the eyelids, okay, because of the facial involvement around the muscles of the eye. So when the patient tries to close, so what happens? The eyeball rolls upward. Okay, so the eyeball usually rolls upward. And here you can see the palpebral fascia is wider than the normal. So these are the different symptoms of the signs and the symptoms. So here you can see the nasal labial fold also disappear, and when you ask the patient to cleanse the teeth, then you ask the patient to smile or show the teeth, what happens? The angle of the mouth usually deviates towards the opposite side here. Okay, angle of mouth also deviates towards the opposite side. So whenever there is failure to supply the muscles of the failure to supply the buccinator muscle here. So what happens? The buccinator muscle lies here, so the patient won't be able to do the whistling. And so whenever a patient tries to whistle, the air escapes out of this angle of the mouth here. Then food also gets accumulated in the vestibule of the mouth. So these are the different signs and the symptoms of the facial nerve palsy. When can it occur? When can the facial nerve palsy occur? It's common, so during exposure to the cold, also the Bell's palsy can occur during sudden exposure to the cold. The Bell's palsy can occur. Okay, so these are the different clinical aspects of the facial nerve. So you should know the supranuclear, nuclear, and the infranuclear region. And in the infranuclear, how the Bell's palsy can occur. And whenever there is injury to the skull bone, that is in the internal acoustic meatus, so along with the facial nerve, other that is the vestibulocochlear nerve can also be injured. Now coming to the another nerve, that is the 8th cranial nerve, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, so it is a spatial sensory, the spatial somatic afferent nerve. So it is mainly concerned with equilibrium as well as the hearing. So vestibulocochlear. So it mainly consists of two components. So it consists of vestibular component, which is mainly responsible for the equilibrium, and it also consists of the cochlear component, which is mainly concerned for the hearing. So the 8th cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve. So here again you can see the vestibulocochlear nerve also emerges from the pontomedullary junction. Okay, so this is the junction of pons and medulla. So it also emerges from the pontomedullary junction, and from here it enters the internal acoustic meatus. So here you can see the vestibular component here, okay, and the cochlear component. So this is the vestibular part here, this is the cochlear part here. So this is inside the petrous part of the temporal bone. So this is the petrous part of the temporal bone. So as it is also responsible for the equilibrium as well as the hearing. So it runs within the petrous part of the temporal bone. Now coming to the vestibular nerve separately. First, let's start with vestibular. So nuclei of the vestibular nerve. Okay. Now, the vestibular nerve, it mainly consists of four nuclei. So they are the superior nuclei, inferior. So superior nucleus, inferior nucleus, the medial and the lateral here. So it consists of four nuclei. Superior, inferior, medial, and the lateral. Now, what is the location? So they are in the partly in the pons and partly in the medulla. So you should know the location. So they are partly in pons and partly in the medulla, and mainly in the vestibular area, which lies in the floor of the fourth ventricle. So whenever you draw the diamond-shaped floor of the fourth ventricle, you are supposed to draw this. So you should know where the facial colliculum lies. You should know where the vestibular area is. Now this is the vestibular nerve nuclei. So these are the four vestibular nerve nuclei. Now coming to different functional components. So as you know, it is mainly concerned for equilibrium as well as the hearing. So the vestibular mainly is for the equilibrium now. So the coming to functional components. So it consists of spatial proprioceptive fibers for the static equilibrium. Okay. So spatial proprioceptive fiber for the static equilibrium. So that the receptors lies in the hair cells of macule. Okay. That is of saccular nutricus. Now we must be wondering what is this. So this is the figure of the internal ear. Okay, so these are the parts of the internal ear. So these are the three semicircular ducts. So these are the three semicircular ducts. They lie within the three semicircular canals. So the snail-shaped duct. So this is known as the cochlear duct, and this the dilated part. So this is the macula. This is ventricle and saccular. So inside it lies the macula. So these are the different parts of the internal ear. So semicircular ducts, we have a cochlear duct here, and inside the vestibule lies the saccule and the ventricle. This is saccule and this is ventricle. Now, the functional component of the vestibular nerve, that is also for the static equilibrium. So they lie in the hair cells of this saccule and ventricle. So within it lies the receptor. and the special proprioceptive fibers for the kinetic equilibrium, for the which is concerned with the movement of the head and the body. So for kinetic equilibrium, they lie within the hair cells of ampulla of the three semicircular duct. Now these are the three semicircular ducts. So within this lie the receptors of the proprioceptive fibers for the kinetic equilibrium, and within this, okay, sacral and ventricle lie the receptors for the static equilibrium. Okay, so these are mainly the functional components of the vestibular. Now, the afferent fiber, so they arise from the vestibular ganglion. So here you can see, so this is the vestibular ganglion. Okay, so these are the vestibular nucleus, this is the vestibular ganglion. So the afferent fibers, they arise from the vestibular ganglion, which is at the trunk of the vestibular nerve itself. So this is the vestibular nerve here. Okay, so the afferent fibers arise from the vestibular nerve here, whereas the efferent fibers, they arise from the superior and the accessory olivary nuclei. Okay, so the efferent fibers arise from the superior as well as the accessory olivary nuclei. So now this is the vestibular nerve from where the afferent fibers arise. Now come to the orders of neuron. So first order neuron. So the first order neuron is it mainly arises from the central process of the ganglion cells. So that is around the trunk of the vestibular nerve. So from here the first order neuron arise, and here and they synapse here with the four vestibular nuclei here. Okay. So this is the first order neuron here, which arise from the trunk of the vestibular nerve. Then these fibers, their synapse here with the four vestibular nuclei. Okay. Now from after synapsing with the vestibular nuclei, now few fibers they run towards the flocculonodular lobe of the cerebellum. Okay, so the flocculonodular lobe of the cerebellum. And the second order neuron is from the vestibular nuclei. Here, from the vestibular nuclei. So from here, the few fibers, they also go to the vestibulospinal tract. So here it forms the vestibulospinal tract. Okay, so from the vestibular nuclei to the spinal cord, so vestibulospinal tract, and here it also forms, so through the motor nuclei of the third, fourth, and the sixth nerves. Okay, so from the vestibular nuclei to the third, fourth, and the sixth nerve nuclei, here it forms the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Okay, so trunk of the vestibular nerve here, they synapse with the vestibular nuclei here. So this is the vestibular nuclei, which lies partly in the pons and partly in the medulla. Okay, now some fibers here, they go towards the flocculonodular lobe of the cerebellum, whereas some fibers they form the vestibulospinal tract here, and some they form the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Now, through the connections of the vestibular nerve, okay, so it controls the movements of the eyes as well as the head, neck, trunk, and it also maintains the balance. So through all these connections, okay, so vestibulospinal, medial longitudinal fasciculus, flocculonodular lobe, so it helps to maintain the, or it helps to control the movements of the head and neck, trunk, as well as the eyes. Come to the cochlear nerve. So cochlear nerve is mainly responsible for the hearing, isn't it? So the cochlear is mainly responsible for hearing. So the receptors for the cochlear nerve, they lie in the organ of the corti. So the receptors lie in the organ of the corti, which is present in the within the cochlea. So this is the cochlea, the snail-shaped stalk. So that is the cochlea. So within the cochlear duct lies the spiral organ of corti. So there lies the receptors for hearing. Now the cochlear nerve consists of three order neurons. So first neuron is present in the spiral ganglion. So this is the spiral ganglion of the cochlea. So here lies the first order neuron. Okay. So from here, the peripheral process they usually innervate the hair cells, where the central process is the ends in the ventral and the dorsal cochlear nucleus. So the cochlear nerve, there are only two cochlear nerve nuclei, that is the ventral and the dorsal. Whereas for the vestibular nerve, there are four nuclei. Now the second neuron lies in the nuclei of the cochlear nerve. Now you can see here, see this is the spiral ganglion of the cochlea. See this is the spiral ganglion of the cochlea. So this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now within the inferior cerebellar peduncle lies the nuclei of the cochlear nerve. So this is the anterior part. So this is the ventral cochlear nerve nuclei. So this is the posterior part. So this is the dorsal cochlear nerve nuclei. So there are two cochlear nerve nuclei. So this is the ventral cochlear nerve nuclei and this is the dorsal cochlear nerve nuclei. They lie within the inferior cervicular peduncle. Okay. Now the fibers from these nuclei, the ventral as well as the dorsal. So fibers from these nuclei, they end in the dorsal nucleus of the trapezoid body. Now this is the dorsal nucleus of the trapezoid body. So you can see the fibers, okay, coming from this nuclei. They are synapting here in the dorsal nucleus of the trapezoid body. So that is the second order neuron. Now from the dorsal nucleus of the trapezoid body here, you can see the fibers. So number of fibers running, okay. So you can see the fibers running towards the inferior colliculus here, and some of the fibers they form the lateral lemniscus here, and some of the fibers they run towards the medial geniculate body. Okay, so these are the two cochlear nerve nuclei here, ventral and the dorsal. Then they run towards the dorsal nucleus of the trapezoid body. From the trapezoid body, you can see the number of fibers. Here they are forming the lateral lemniscus here, and some fibers they run towards the inferior colliculus here for the, this is mainly responsible for the auditory reflex, and some fibers they are going towards the medial geniculate body, which is responsible for the hearing. Now coming to the aspects here, the vestibular cochlear nerve frequently interfere with the facial nerve. So this because it is fractured, the skull is both are injured simultaneously. Now coming to another nerve, so that is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, now the glossopharyngeal nerve is the ninth cranial nerve. So this is also a mixed nerve. Okay, so the ninth cranial nerve, it is a mixed nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now, where do you find the origin? Where is the origin of this nerve? It is in the upper part of the medulla. So the glossopharyngeal nerve, it lies in the upper part of the medulla oblongata. Now coming to its different functional components. So even the glossopharyngeal nerve has got the branchiomotor fibers, then fibers. It has got preganglionic secretomotor fibers to supply the parotid gland. The bronchiomotor fibers, they usually supply the stylopharyngeus muscle. The only muscle which is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve is the stylopharyngeus muscle, muscles of pharynx. Then inferior salivary nucleus gives rise to the origin of the preganglionic secretomotor fibers to supply the parotid gland. Then the upper part of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. So it is mainly responsible for the pain, touch, and temperature from the posterior one of the tongue, and the general visual sensation from the carotid body and the carotid sinus. So let me show you the nucleus here. So this is the motor nucleus. Okay. So this is in the upper part of the medulla. Now this is the motor nucleus of the glossopharyngeal nerve, from where the branchiomotor fiber arise. So next is the inferior salivary nucleus. Now this is the inferior salivary nucleus. Okay, so motor nucleus here. This is the inferior salivary nucleus for the secretomotor fibers to the parotid gland. In the upper part of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so this is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve here. Okay, so this is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve here, and you'll also find this nucleus of the tractus solidaris here. So these are the different nuclei. Now coming to its course within the brain, intranuclear course. So after arising after its exit from the nuclear here, so it passes forward and laterally. Okay, so this is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So it passes forward and laterally between the olivary nucleus and the inferior cervicular peduncle. Then it emerges out. So here you can see the glossopharyngeal nerve emerging out from the posterior lateral sulcus of the medulla. So it emerges from the posterior lateral sulcus of the medulla. So from here it comes out of the cranial cavity through the middle compartment of the jugular foramen, isn't it? So from the posterior compartment, what structure comes out? Or what structure passes through the posterior compartment of the jugular foramen? What structure is concerned? Are you listening? Which structure? Which structure is jugular vein? Okay, which structure is present in the posterior compartment? That is the jugular vein. Now, the glossopharyngeal nerve, it comes out to the middle compartment of the jugular foramen. Then, after that, it lies in a groove on the inferior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Okay, so after its exit from the jugular foramen there, it lies on the groove. So it lies on the groove which is present on the inferior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Okay. Then from there, it runs between the internal jugular vein and the internal carotid artery. Okay, now this is the internal carotid artery here. So here, this is the internal carotid artery here. So it runs within the internal jugular vein and the internal carotid artery. So use the external carotid artery. So this is the external carotid artery. This is the internal carotid artery. So first it passes between the internal jugular vein and the internal carotid artery. Okay. Then from there it reaches the stylopharyngeus muscle. Okay. From here it reaches the stylopharyngeus muscle. Now this is the stylopharyngeus muscle. Okay. Around the pharynx. So this is the stylopharyngeus muscle. So from here it reaches the stylopharyngeus muscle to supply it. Okay. Then finally it terminates by dividing into. It gives so many branches. So it gives branches to the tongue here. Okay. So it gives branches to the tonsil here. You can see the tonsillar branches here. Here. Then it gives branches to the pharynx. So there are pharyngeal branches here, and it also gives branches to the posterior third of the tongue. So these are the lingual branches. So communication and development. So 9-cranial nerve, mixed nerve. Okay, so where do you find the nucleus? In the upper part of the medulla. So it has got the bronchiomotor fibers which arise from the motor nucleus to supply the stylopharyngeus muscle. Then it has got inferior salivary nucleus here, from where the preganglionic secretomotor fibers arise to supply the parotid gland. So the other nuclei are spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. It also gives the general visual sensation of the carotid sinus as well as the carotid body. So it emerges out through from here. So it emerges out to the posterolateral surface of the medulla here. Then it enters here to the middle compartment of the jugular foramen. Then after there, it lies on the inferior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone here, and where it lies within the internal jugular vein. And within it, it lies between the internal jugular vein and the internal carotid artery. Okay, then after this course here, it runs towards the stylopharyngeus muscle to supply it, and it gives then at its termination, it has many branches. You can see the lingual branches to the tongue. It gives tonsillar branches to supply the tonsil, and it gives pharyngeal branches to supply the pharynx, as well as it gives palatal branches to supply the soft palate. You can see a number of branches here. Okay, now come to the branches proper. First, so it gives rise to the tympanic branch. So here you can see, okay, it consists of two ganglia here. One is the superior ganglia, the other one is the inferior ganglia. So both these ganglia, they lie on the petrous part of the temporal bone. Now, the tympanic branch from the glossopharyngeal nerve, it arises from the inferior ganglia. Now, this is the superior ganglion of the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is the inferior ganglion. Now, from the inferior ganglion arises the tympanic branch. Now, this is the tympanic branch here. Okay, so this is the tympanic branch here. Then from its origin, it enters the tympanic cavity. So towards the medullary cavity. So it enters the tympanic cavity here, and where it forms the tympanic plexus of the nerves. Okay, so you just remember the glossopharyngeal nerve has got two ganglions, superior and inferior. So from the inferior ganglion, the tympanic branch arises, where it enters the tympanic cavity to form the tympanic plexus of the nerves. So now this tympanic plexus of the nerve, it supplies the mucous membrane of the tympanic cavity. It also supplies the tympanic membrane and as well as the backstride ear cells. Okay, so all those structures are supplied by this tympanic plexus of the nerve. Okay, so it is the lesser petrosal nerve. So the lesser petrosal nerve, It's mainly forms on the tympanic plexus. Now you can see this is the tympanic plexus. Now this is the laser petrosal nerve. The laser petrosal nerve is formed on the tympanic plexus there, and now here you can see how it relates to the OT ganglia. Okay, so here it enters the OT ganglia here. So this is the laser petrosal. If you remember the foramen movement, the laser petrosal nerve it comes up from the foramen movement and ends here to the OT ganglia. Now this is OT ganglia here. Then from here, it supplies the parotid gland. So this is the postganglion vesicular motor fibers to the parotid gland. So this is how it supplies the parotid gland. Now come to the carotid body and the carotid sinus. So here you can see within the, so this is the internal carotid artery, this is the external carotid artery. So here you can see the carotid body, location of the carotid body as well as the carotid sinus, the dilated part here. So this is the carotid sinus and the carotid body. So the glossopharyngeal nerve, so when it passes between the internal and the external carotid artery, here it gives branches to the carotid body as well as the sinus, so which mainly controls the blood pressure and the heart rate. Okay, so the carotid body and the carotid sinus, so they are also supplied by the branches from the glossopharyngeal nerve. And muscular branches, it supplies the stygopharyngeal muscle here. Then the pharyngeal plexus, I've already told, to supply the mucous membrane of the pharynx. Then it also gives rise to tonsillar branches to supply the tonsil, and the posterior mantle of the tongue. See the lingual branches to supply the posterior mantle of the tongue, whereas the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is supplied by which nerve? The anterior two-thirds is supplied by which nerve? Facial. Facial, okay. Which branch? Which branch of facial? Chordae tympani. So the anterior two-thirds. So the taste sensation for the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is by the chordae tympani branch of the facial nerve, whereas the posterior one-third of the tongue is by the lingual branches, which in turn is a branch from the glossopharyngeal nerve. So this you should know my common asked. So this is how the glossopharyngeal nerve is. So you must remember your medulla, then emerging from the posterolateral surface of the medulla, then within the internal jugular foramen where it lies, then below the biggest part of the temporal bone for the inferior